This is episode 13 of Nobody Yet. I'm recording this on February 20 at 10:06 p.m. Eastern Time. Talk depletes us. Talking and doing fight for the same resources. Research shows that while goal visualization is important, after a certain point, our mind begins to confuse it with actual progress. The same goes for verbalization. Even talking aloud to ourselves while we work through difficult problems have shown to significantly decrease insight and breakthroughs. Perhaps one of the most difficult things about this podcast, I guess, aside from the consistency in which consistently committing an hour to 2 hours per week to put an episode in the middle of trying to focus on work, doing lifting, meeting with my friends, that's definitely very difficult, the consistency. But the second part that is actually pretty difficult that I actually didn't think about when previously starting this podcast is kind of the opposite of talking and doing. And I guess on the surface, this is kind of like also one of those no shit things of the more you talk, the less you probably are able to do things. But this is something that's been played out, I guess, a little bit more as I started recording this podcast. I found that while this podcast provides a really good outlet for me to reflect on my past, like maybe upbringing, but also my journey, my identity, how I'm changing week to week, something it also draws away is from the potency of my actions. A lot of my most significant actions have come through hours, or not even hours, but just minutes of like private deliberation without sharing it with anyone. And in a sense, it feels like my actions in that sense are a little bit sharper versus if I were to just say them in a podcast setting, perhaps potentially to the whole world. Now, obviously, this podcast has the benefit of being quite small. So I'm really only talking to like one person, which is me, who re-listens to this podcast when it gets released to make sure the audio is right, but to also just check my speech pattern. But that is one thing to think about. Talk depletes us. Now, that is a quote from the book that I'm currently reading the second time, called Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. And the book is actually pretty effective. It goes through 3 phases of the rise to success, the position of being at success, and then the downfall from success. And it talks about the different lessons or insights about ego that play in these 3 different phases. Now, in this episode this week, I want to cover the first third. So it's a rise to success. And I'm not going to cover every chapter, but I'm going to cover the chapters that are most relevant to me. And I'm going to speak of the chapters as if I'm lecturing my future self. So I'm going to say the word you a lot. And in a sense, I'm not really talking to you, the audience, unless you want me to, of course. But I'm really just talking to future me. I say that a lot in these episodes, but this episode is extremely like so. I kind of want to have a past self berating my future self to think about the lessons from this book. If I were to, let's say, not reread this book for a long time. There are a lot of good insights in this book, and this book is structured in having, I guess, like maybe 5 or 7 or so insights per each chapter. And it develops the insights through talking about different research, historical figures, and just experiences from known authors' life. Now, I'm going to take many quotes from these parts, and specifically, I'll be talking about 4 chapters in The Rise. Now, the quote I started this podcast on, the talk depletes us, that's from the chapter Talk, Talk, Talk. And I find that is especially relevant to me now, given that now I do this weekly podcast thing that even though no one listens to, I'm still talking a lot now, much more than it was previously, about my life and the things I'm thinking about. Another quote. Talking, listening to ourselves talk, performing for an audience is almost like therapy. I just spent 4 hours talking about this. Doesn't that count for something? The answer is no. Something that I will also have to keep in mind as I continue doing this podcast is how doing this podcast does not equate to actually making progress in life. For me, this podcast serves as an outlet, of course. I think a lot, I have a lot of insights for me personally, and I want to find a way to record them such that I don't really have to worry about the linguistics of English in terms of writing. Since linguistics is something I care a lot about and vocabulary, I tend to overthink that when I write. And this podcast serves as a medium to just strip all those away and focus solely on the insights and the ideas that I have to communicate to my future self. It's important to remind myself that this does not mean I'm making progress in work. This doesn't mean I'm making progress in working out or making progress in being more social or meeting friends or whatever goal I may have, aside from the goal of being more wise or being more introspective. This podcast doesn't serve any of that. And that's something very important to think about. This podcast only serves as a medium to track where I am. So in light of thinking about these concepts about talk, it's important to remind myself that this podcast is mostly for reflection. I don't really want to look forward in this podcast. Obviously, I'll do things like New Year's resolutions, but I want to limit the amount of foresight or dreaming or ambitions that I want to talk about in this podcast, kind of in the fear of that it'll take away from the potency of action that I have in my daily life. This podcast is about looking back, not looking forward. So I want to keep that in mind. Talk depletes us. Talking and doing fight for the same resources. So I must be careful where I allocate those resources. Now, aside from the frame of the podcast, I find talking is also pretty interesting when I think about it in terms of like meeting up with friends for dinner and stuff like that. Even when I talk to my close friends over dinner, and these are like the close friends I love talking to, and these are really the quality friends, I always keep in mind about not oversharing things about what I'm thinking about. And of course, these are my like very close friends, so I want to overshare everything. But there are some things that I do keep back, and they're mostly the things of my greatest pursuits that I want to do, or some of my greater goals that I'm chasing after. And this is not so much in the sense that I fear trusting my close friends, because I don't, but this is more of the fear of vying for those same resources. Instead of doing and chasing that goal, I'll just talk about it. And talking about the goal gives the same, or give a similar, I believe, dopamine profile or some happiness profile as it does for actually working towards the goal. Now, of course, talking about the goal actually doesn't result in the goal occurring. Kind of speaking into reality is pretty bullshit if you don't actually work on it in any regard. You have to work on the goal for the goal to actually be reality. Talking doesn't do anything. I just spent 4 hours talking about this. Doesn't that count for something? The answer is no. So this even applies for, aside from this podcast, but for dinners, or just meeting up with friends, being careful what I talk about, because I don't want to take away from the action that I want to pursue on a day-by-day basis. Next chapter. Don't be passionate. Quote, passion. It's all about passion. Find your passion. Live passionately. Inspire the world with your passion. Here's what those same people haven't told you. Your passion may be the very thing holding you back from power or influence or accomplishment. Because just as often we fail with passion, or we fail because of passion. End quote. Maybe except the end where you messed up a bit, but regardless. Now this is me talking to me. You focus a lot on passion, particularly finding your passion. After all, that is one of the main themes in your life. Finding whatever it is that you absolutely love to work on. And that may be important, and that is important. But the thirst for that thing should not override reason, nor should it override action. Quote, in our endeavors, we will face complex problems, often in situations we've never faced before. Opportunities are not usually deep, virgin pools that require courage and boldness to dive into, but are instead obscured, dusted overarm blocked by various forms of resistance. What is really called for in these circumstances is clarity, deliberateness, and methodological. Damn, I'm really bad at reading, huh? Methodological determination. I probably pronounced that wrong too. But too often we proceed like this. A flash of inspiration. I want to be the best and biggest blank ever. Be the youngest blank. The only one to blank. The firstest with the mostest. End quote. So this is particularly relevant to me because, as I've said in previous episodes and probably as I told my friends a lot, is that I really want to find what I'm passionate about. And I think everyone wants to find what they're passionate about. That's really no lie. Like, if you live a life, you ideally want to find things that you're very interested in. Find things, find people, find places, just things that you absolutely love and you want to hold on tightly to. That idea of passion. And for me, in terms of work, I think about passion a lot. And it kind of draws me away from various opportunities that, I'm not interested in or I'm not passionate in, but actually gave me great dividends, not in terms of things that I would no longer care for, but in lessons or in skills that I can't really foresee in the present time. Passion is this interesting thing where I feel like I want to chase, or I know I want to chase, but it isn't always locally optimal to chase passion. Perhaps a more roundabout path may be taken instead of walking directly towards passion. I might need to do things that are more disinteresting or do things that are more cumbersome versus the thing that's always the most passionate. I think that's where sound judgment comes in. And of course, trying to make decisions under uncertainty. Another quote. As a result, we hear what we want to hear, we do what we feel like doing, and despite being incredibly busy and working very hard, we accomplish very little. Passion in itself, in this sense, has a very seductive attraction in the sense of perhaps two things. One is choosing, like making decisions, and this kind of goes in the same talk I said before about choosing things that are perhaps not the most optimally passionate for, or the most locally optimally passionate for greater pursuit, and something that's more globally passionate. But a second, in terms of actually performing action. We hear what we want to hear, we do what we feel like doing, and despite being incredibly busy and working really hard, we accomplish very little. In terms of action, I feel passion has two sides. One is in terms of waiting. So I said the quote, I'll come back to the quote after. So leave a pin, I'll come back to it. But what in terms of waiting? I think because I'm trying to find something I'm passionate in, I often see myself just kind of sitting there a lot of the time. I sit there when thinking about new projects I want to start. I sit there thinking about new hobbies I want to pursue. I kind of just sit there thinking about maybe restaurants I want to try. Obviously, that falls out of the greater scheme of something that's more deeply passionate, but you kind of get the sense. I kind of just sit there thinking. And if we think about making progress, thinking is seductive. It feels like we're doing something. Similar to talking, I just spent so long thinking about this, it feels like I've actually went closer towards the goal. But in reality, I'm still the same state as I was previously. I made no action. And at least for me, as someone who overthinks too much, I need to now kind of try to over-index on action. I'm trying to label or reframe in my mind these days that thinking doesn't mean anything. I could think a lot about one thing, but if I don't change my action or I don't actually do anything from that thinking, it means that I've done nothing. The thinking was effectively useless. And that's something I'm trying to reframe my mind now, to over-index on action instead of thinking, since I way over-index on thinking. So that's kind of a self-correction to me. But in terms of passion, it's important to make sure that this search for passion or this lust for passion doesn't inhibit the actual action to actually pursue passion in the first place. This goes back to one of Alex Hormozi's quote, which I think about too, is not making a decision to not always make the best decision, but try to go in the right direction. In terms of passion, I don't need to do the thing that is most immediately passionate to me, since I won't know what that thing is. And sitting there for hours, days, and weeks obviously is not going to help figure that out. Maybe the best thing I should do is just moving, is just trying. And this is the attempt of walking in the right direction. And in doing so and walking in some right direction, at least I'll have indicators that this is more interesting or this is not a path I want to walk down on. And that eliminates one other thing I would be exploring to find what I'm passionate in. And this actually makes more progress instead of just sitting there and thinking about the many things I could be doing. Passion, doesn't that count for something? The answer is no. Obviously took that for talk, but I feel like passion has the same feeling to it. Just because I feel so passionate about something, I have the flashes of inspiration that I'm going to be the best in this thing. That doesn't mean anything if I don't do anything about it. So passion must not obscure action. So that's one. Now, coming back to the quote of, despite being incredibly busy and working very hard, we accomplish very little. I think about my approach to work. And one of the chapters is about work, so I'll come back to work as well and talk about it more deeply. But one of the things about work I find myself doing is I rev myself up to work. I have like this whole ritual in which I hype myself up. I try to get caffeine, I get sunlight, all kind of like the good sciencey things that would boost dopamine levels to help you stay more concentrated. And then there's also like the thing of like revving up my willpower, feeling like it's almost as if I'm gonna like go in for like a bench press PR or something. But now I'm gonna go and get a work concentration PR for how hard I concentrated for this work block. It feels like I'm revving myself up to that sense just to sit down and do work. And in many ways, this actually is pretty effective. But when I think about it holistically, I could drive myself to be very busy. I could push myself to work really hard. But when passion is involved in there, it still feels like, or not feels like, I objectively accomplish very little. The passion is there that makes everything so much more like artistic. It feels like I'm actively making progress with all the hype that I build up in my system, even though I've actively made no progress at all. It feels like I'm doing something given this optimization of sunlight, of caffeine, of all these things. But in reality, I still haven't made any progress. So in this sense, passion not only seems to obscure movement for action, but it also obscures the progress being made when actually working hard. And that's something to keep in mind. To focus on the progress and not so much about like the passion and the input that's trying to be put into here. This connects back to one of my earlier podcast episodes about work. If work is input times leverage equals output, I want to focus on output because output is a thing that I'm working to produce. Input is cool, which is kind of like passion is an input. Passion makes input feel more strong and feels more lively. But if this equation doesn't result in more output, then that passion is effectively useless. Don't be passionate. And perhaps there's like a better approach, which the author also says, and I written down, is methodological. I like methodical a bit better. I think that's how I pronounce it. Methodical determination. I think that's a much more elegant way to put it. It's still kind of bringing in those elements of willpower with the aspect of determination. It feels like I'm chasing after something. But instead of blindly running towards it, it's kind of looking at the steps that I need to take, figuring out what rocks I need to jump on, and figuring out how to get there in the cleanest way possible. Now, it won't always be clean, but there's judgment involved, and it's not just like bulldozing for every single problem that you come through. So that is, don't be passionate. Third chapter. Get out of your own head. Quote, instead of finding out how something they desire might actually come about, they pass that over so as to avoid tiring deliberation of what's possible. They assume that what they desire is available and proceed to arrange the rest, taking pleasure in thinking through everything they'll do when they have what they want, thereby making their lazy souls even lazier. Real people preferring to live in passionate fiction than in actual reality. Now I'm going to lecture my future self. How many times have you thought about some goal and envision yourself already accomplishing the upper echelon on achievement in that area without actually putting in the work? You thought that you were going to be this fashion designer, designing all this interesting next-gen asymmetric tops while beginning to only dabble in sewing. You haven't finished sewing a single t-shirt, and you imagine the unimaginable already. You imagine the upper echelon already. This is similar to your new job as well. You think that talking to a high-ranking person during an interview or spearheading some feature is going to kind of put you at the top of your company? No. You haven't even reached out to talk to this person yet, nor have you actually pushed anything super, super impactful. You need evidence to give you the confidence to believe in that ability. You enjoy living life in fantasy because in that world, achievement is certain, it's easy, and it's euphoric, despite being only imaginary. You get to stroke your ego despite it not actually being true, despite your dreams actually not being reality. Because in your twisted imagination that you think this dream somehow is true. I find that I think about these thought patterns a lot in terms of when I start pursuing something. When I start pursuing something, I often, for some reason, automatically default to like the greatest regards of that thing. Another example aside from sewing and starting my job is powerlifting. So I competed in my first powerlifting competition earlier last year, sorry. Probably exactly a year ago in February. And after that competition, I somehow got the idea that I would be like world champion or like compete on the world national stage. And I remember looking at the numbers that people in my weight class lifted. And I was like, yeah, I could definitely reach there eventually. Even though the people lifted like 200 or like 300 pounds more than what I currently lift. Now, is it wrong to say that I'll get there eventually? Not really, because if I dedicate myself, I may be able to get there eventually. Maybe, unless like my biological limitation is like preventing me to do so, which obviously I won't know, and most chances I probably won't get there anyways. But yeah, maybe there is some slimmer possibility that I'll get there. Fine, I could give myself that. But I only just competed in one competition. What makes me think that I should totally achieve what the best of the best who's been doing this for decades would achieve? There is kind of like the balance of delusion, but also like kind of you need to have belief before you have evidence sometimes. So that's something that's hard to square in the circle currently. But it's still an argument about not dreaming for the best and the mostest and the biggest immediately without even diving into the thing that is currently being pursued. I feel dreaming this big so early on, the only utility there is basically just stroking the ego. It's believing that I could be so good at this one thing and watch me, people out there, watch me be super good at this one thing. It's believing that my ego, or it's believing that my own self has more value beyond kind of this area of expertise that I currently have. It's believing that I'm more important than I actually am. this ultimately has kind of two consequences I found in terms of like living in this fantasy early on. It's one, it's the negative self-image with belief and identity that diverges from action. I feel like for me, given that I'm very introspective and I think I'm pretty honest with myself, I feel like I have this internal contradiction that occurs. Like, if let's say hypothetically, this is obviously an example I'm making up and is not currently true, but hypothetically, like if I'm pursuing some sort of like software startup, right? It's like me believing that I'm going to be the next like Mark Zuckerberg immediately. And this is my belief. But my identity has not really reached there and may not ever reach there. It probably won't ever reach there. My identity, let's say when starting a software startup, is probably a person who's struggling to pay rent, or probably is paying rent just from savings, but is probably not making a lot of money, is probably super stressed, doesn't really know what he's doing, and very, very insecure about everything, like in terms of software, the business, marketing, just kind of anything technical in that realm. So there's like a divergence between my actual identity and like the belief of who I would reach. And it's not only just any belief, but it's like some upper echelon, unrealistic belief of who I'd be. And that divergence, at least for me, creates this internal contradiction. And it's kind of like a sense of torture that I have. It's kind of like me self-whipping myself into thinking, why are you not there yet? You're such a loser. Like, look at you now. You're not there yet. And it's constantly that whip, just constantly whipping myself. And that obviously is not the most positive thing. While it may be very potent and very potent fuel to get me places, it's still nonetheless very toxic. So that's something to be careful about as one of the consequences of this. The second, I mentioned before, is that it's a sedation into actually pursuing reality. When thinking so much about something and like believing you're going to be the best and the most, that might be cool, but the outcome itself is not really affected. In the book, one example was given about a Union general during the American Civil War. Quote, "Ego robbed General McClellan of the ability to think that he even needed to act. He thought that he already won the war, and he thought that his army was too strong to be defeated. And as a result of that, he just didn't do anything. The smaller army, so the opposite of the Union, which I guess is the Confederate, ? I'm not sure. I'm not really well versed in the Civil War. I'm not well versed in American history in general. But because of this, his larger army was like overtaken by an army that was like three times smaller than his size. So it was this inaction that costed him the battle or the war or whatever it is." Moving on. Next quote. "We plug in some headphones and all of a sudden there's a soundtrack. We flip up our jacket collar and consider briefly how cool we must look. We replay the successful meeting we're heading towards in our head. The crowds part as we pass. We're fearless warriors on our way to the top." This is a beautiful quote that like just completely summarizes how I feel when I'm like doing menial tasks. Specifically like when I'm walking to the subway to work. I live like 12 to 15 minutes from the closest subway, so I must walk there every morning to actually get to work. And this is exactly what I feel. I'm like, I have headphones on, I'm listening to like some rap playlist, and I'm literally thinking about how much I'm going to like just completely murder the day. I'm going to kill all my meetings, I'm going to finish all the tickets, and I'm going to be the best of the best of the best, and something crazy good will happen to me that day. But like, yeah, that might be true like one day or 2 days. But like, thinking about this every single day is an overkill. There is no soundtrack. I definitely don't look as cool as I think I look. The meeting that I'm heading towards is not going to go as successful as I think it will go. The crowds don't pass. And while, yeah, I might be a fearless warrior, that in itself is also kind of incorrect as well, because there's many things I fear. And maybe walking to work is not the most warrior-ish activity either. Thinking about this, I know there's a huge saying of like, you should think that you're a main character in your own story. And in many ways, I think that's still very like accurate. I think that I should believe that I'm writing out my own story and that I'm the main person living it, because I am the main person living it. That in itself is like factually true. But the danger here is overestimating my importance in like the greater world. I'm the main character in my story, but I'm definitely not the main character in the whole course of history. Perhaps no one is, because everyone who's died, like the people who are the richest person on earth, let's say like 50 years ago, no one knows their name. No one knows who they are. Even some of the most impactful people in history. For example, how many people actually know who John D. Rockefeller is? The person who monopolized oil back in like the 1820s or something. I don't know what year it is, but it's very, very early on, before cars. How many people actually know who he is? Yeah, his name, his like last name is on different buildings. The Rockefeller building is one prime example, but no one actually really knows the person behind that. In many generations after death, is like almost 100% that will be forgotten. So in that sense, I'm not a main character in the progress of human civilization. I'm a main character in my story, sure. But I shouldn't live in fantasy because of that. Quote, living clearly and presently takes courage. Don't live in the haze of the abstract. Live with the tangible and real, even if, especially if, it's uncomfortable. Be part of what's going on around you. Feast on it. Adjust for it. There's no one to perform for. There's just work to be done and lessons to be learned in all that is around us. So actually operationalizing this, converting this into like some actionable actions. One, avoid thinking about the end goal too much. This works off the previous things about talk, and don't be passionate as well. But avoid thinking about the end goal so much. This is a constant reframe and thought pattern that will need to be like repeated over and over again, is to, at least for me, don't think about the end goal, don't think about the end goal, don't think about the end goal, don't think about the greatest person that you're going to be, don't think about like the billionaire that you want to be, not that you actually want to be there, but don't think about kind of the most extreme outliers in this field that you're going to pursue. You need to catch yourself when you're thinking about those thought patterns and then actively breathe deeply or try to transfer yourself back into the present about whatever you're doing. Whether you're walking, you're actually doing legitimate work, you're reading, try to transfer yourself back in the present to avoid thinking these large scale end goals. To piggyback off that, if you think about the greatest entrepreneurs, take Jeff Bezos, for example. When he first started pursuing Amazon, what are the odds that he was pursuing Amazon because he was like, oh, I'm going to be a billionaire and one of the richest people on earth? I would think the odds of him thinking that early on is like next to zero. Well, I'm not certain. I'm pretty sure he was not thinking, I'm going to be like the top 3 richest people on the earth from this idea. I definitely don't think he was thinking that during the .com bubble when Amazon almost went bankrupt. So if he's one example, and I'm sure there's like many other examples out there, then I'm sure that I myself should follow this as well. Don't have my ego of who I believe I could become run further than my actual action to get there. Second step is taking things more by step. So like not thinking about the end goal so much, think about more like intermediate goals and think about the little steps I need to actually get there. If I take the powerlifting example, don't think about becoming like the world champion. Think about like just increasing your total, or think about like competing at the next meet. Set the flag of achievement there and then try to accomplish that, and then go and see where that takes you. So it's just adjusting the view towards the summit, down towards like the next checkpoint. Third, prioritizing action over thought. Sometimes I just need to shoot from the hip. I feel like a lot of things of what I do is like spawn from like hours of like thought. And yeah, sure, that like is cool, good decision making, but like that's just too slow, right? And then that also gives room for me thinking about like, oh, the person I could become and stuff like that, which obviously doesn't have utility if it doesn't parlay into actual action. I need to make sure that I'm getting out of my own head and I'm actually executing instead of thinking. There's another good quote. I forgot who said it, but it goes by, a lack of confidence killed more dreams than a lack of competence ever did. For me right now, my competence for sure exceeds my confidence. And to kind of reverse this wrong, I should just act more. Just shoot from the hip. Even though there'll probably be a higher likelihood of failure, just shoot from the hip. Just act faster and things might break. And if they do, go back, fix it. You'll learn your lessons and move on. Get out of your own head. Fourth and last chapter, work, work, work. Quote, every time you sit down to work, remind yourself, I am delaying gratification by doing this. I'm passing the marshmallow test. I'm earning what my ambition burns for. I'm making an investment in myself instead of in my ego. Now this is me talking to myself. You like the concept of working more than the actual act of working. You like to talk about the inglorious nature of work without submitting to it. Work is a fairly simple concept. You sit down, you open your computer, you remove distractions, and you work. There's nothing else to it. All the other extras on top of work is excessive and rarely result in further progress. Understand that delayed gratification is a skill that needs to be trained, and it is only trained by work. Lately, you've seemed to enjoy rushing gratification forward and wanting everything now. Maybe that is in itself the fear of failure. You fear that you'll fail and your career will run into a standstill where you have no idea where to go. And in response, you want success now because the confirmation of success now will ward off the fear of failure and the stagnation in the future. This runs contrary to delayed gratification. Remember that you will not be able to have it now and may not ever have it for a very long time in the span of years and decades. That's okay. Just keep working, because work will be the only thing that speeds up the progress to achieve the gratification that you so ardently crave. Another quote. You could lie to yourself, saying that you put in the time or pretend that you're working, but eventually someone will show up. You'll be tested and quite possibly found out. End quote. So I think my relationship with work has been quite, I don't want to say complex because work in itself is a pretty simple concept, but it's definitely one of the more like rare ones that I often think. And maybe it's like spread by some people on social media, which is probably why I'm a little bit biased because I consumed them since I was a kid. I tend to see work as like this glorious thing that I'm pursuing. It's kind of like being the Roman gladiator, jumping into Colosseum and killing all the tigers and the other gladiators in pursuit of like internal glory. That's kind of like what it feels like sometimes when I'm sitting down and opening my laptop and trying to do work. And this is an extension of getting out your own head and like not being as passionate. But work is exactly the opposite. Like no matter how much glory I try to attribute it, work is not glorious. It really isn't. I think about a lot of the great, like, impactful things I did at, like, for example, my previous company, since I've been there for a long time. The actual work to produce that glorious thing, literally, I put a camera into my face and I record myself working, is literally me just sitting there on my ass for weeks and just typing on my computer. That's it. There's no glory behind it. And in a sense, like, work in media is pretty glorified in terms of like movies. You have like the old like Rocky cutscene when there's like the soundtrack and he's doing like sit-ups and he's doing like runs in the winter, and just getting ready for a big fight. In present times, there's like the Instagram influencers who are like, oh my god, like, look how hard I'm working, and then they have like pictures of their coffee or their like work routine and whatever. But work in itself is a fairly simple concept. For me, I just open my laptop and I start typing. That's it. The mental masturbation, which I think is a beautiful term, by the way. The mental masturbation around work doesn't really amount to anything. It just feels like I'm making progress while no progress is actually being made. I feel good, but nothing actually happens. So that's kind of like the romanticization around work that I should try to mitigate. Try not to mentally masturbate to work too much. So that's one. The second is delayed gratification. So I feel, and there's a lot of times, and this is happening especially lately, I feel like I want everything now. I want all my greatest ambitions now. Greatest ambitions, getting in my own head. Coming back to that topic. Anyways, you'll find that a lot of these chapters connect to one another. Especially when there's like a lot of themes in your life, and you find that a lot of them fit in the framework of these chapters. But yeah, I feel like I definitely want my greatest ambitions now. And because I want it now, it feels like every second in which that is not being realized, it feels like I'm wasting my life. And that's not actually true, because a lot of people require a lot of time to do great things. Obviously, great things don't just come immediately. For some, like, it's like winning the lottery. Yeah, sure. But that's like a very small percentage of people anyways. For most of the people, it's through a consistent, slow grind to get there. And that grind is not glorious. So I should constantly think about delayed gratification. It's not getting the thing now. It's passing the marshmallow test. It's slowly earning what the ambition burns for. I'm making an investment in myself instead of my ego. Continuously thinking about this delayed gratification. Now, on to the next quote that I said earlier. I'll repeat it now since I'm getting to that topic. Quote, you can lie to yourself saying that you put in time or pretend that you're working, but eventually someone will show up. You'll be tested and quite possibly found out. Now me talking to myself. How do you make yourself undeniable? That undeniability to any observer, even the most affluent and talented, how do you make sure that you're undeniably a hard worker? The answer is simple again. Intense, focused work for long periods of time. So now there's two frames that I like to actually think about. And I think a lot of people think that these frames are inherently toxic, but I found them to be very useful. And it is purely metaphorical and not actually like legitimate. And I'll point out kind of the asterisks of why it's not legitimate is purely just kind of like a motivational thought process that I go through. That only affects how hard I work and doesn't really affect my energy towards other people. But let's get there. So there's two frames. And there's the underdog and the person on top. So I like to think about myself as in the middle, and then there's some underdog below me and some superior person on top. At any moment, there's that person beneath me, the David to my Goliath, who is trying to take my spot in everything I have. That person is trying to work at where I'm working and is trying to accomplish what I've accomplished, and what I'm going to accomplish. I need to make sure that that person never sees the light of day. I want to make sure that I run faster and further with more vigor than that person with that underdog mentality can muster up. Because if that person ever succeeds in their endeavors, it is me who's going to suffer the losses. Now, obviously in reality, this is not true, since it's not a zero-sum game. Just because they win doesn't mean I lose. Like, we can all win. So that's like an asterisk to put in there. But this is something that's super powerful that I like to think about rarely to kind of get my ass going again. It's thinking about how I'm the Goliath, and instead of letting David throw rocks at you, it's taking the club that you have as Goliath and beating that person down and making sure that they're dead and they can no longer get up, that they have no chance in getting what you got. This kind of connects to Kobe Bryant's work ethic as well. There's many stories about Kobe Bryant who, when he played basketball still and was not retired, he would work out for like crazy hours and he wouldn't like party. So there are times when, let's say, like an athlete or someone on his team, or I think it was like someone on the opposite team who was playing him that day, walked into the gym at like 6 a.m., which is pretty early for them, and they got a good sweat in, and they think they're going to beat everyone, right? They think they're going to work harder than everyone that day, and they have like their spirits up. But then they walk in the gym, and they just see Kobe in the gym already, in a full drench, so he's fully like wet from sweat, and he's just shooting shots on his own. And in that sense, that person who's just saw Kobe working so hard became a bit deflated. It's like Kobe, to put in David Goggins' terms, took his soul. That person at that point realized that, oh, that's a different level and I can never get there. That's how I want to make sure the underdog sees me as. I want the underdog to see me as a person so great in terms of their work ethic that they cannot be caught up to, that it's a fruitless task. I want that person to give up. To put myself in that frame, I think why this underdog frame of thinking someone else is an underdog who's trying to get what I have is so powerful is because I myself saw myself as the underdog. Back when I was recruiting for university, trying to go for an Ivy Leagues back then, I came from like a very average high school, and I only learned about like, let's say like the SATs and everything like very, very late. I started preparing for the SATs in like end of grade 10 sort of thing. So, and like my school didn't have any enrichment programs. So I like realistically, I didn't really have a shot. I had like a crapshoot to get in, maybe like a luck of the dice, or I got the administration officers on a good day. But in reality, I didn't really have a chance. But I saw myself as an underdog who's going to absolutely take everything that all the talented people above me had. And in order to take whatever they had, I was going to work my butt off to do so. And in that sense, I was willing to sacrifice weekends. I was willing to sacrifice days after school. I was willing to sacrifice birthdays, holidays. Like, those meant nothing to me because I wanted what they had, and I'm going to get it. And obviously, even though I didn't get it, it still put me in a position, a very favorable position, that I'm able to parlay into my realities today. So this idea of thinking that there's someone, like a younger version of myself, who's trying to claw and grab everything that I own, for me is very powerful. Because I just think about my younger self. And I think about how much I want to just make sure that that younger image of myself has no chance of achieving whatever he wants to achieve. And that makes me in the present work harder. Now, this is one side of the frame. The other frame is that, well, just like how someone's the underdog to me, I'm the underdog to someone else. And this is the frame I took as the young kid. But it is my job, just like the underdog to me, to get to where they are and take whatever it is that they have, is to make sure that that person above me is my version of Goliath to my David, is to make sure that that Goliath understands and realizes my presence and regrets ever overlooking and ignoring my ambition. I want to take what's theirs and continue forward. So it's kind of like the fear of the underdog that they're going to reach me, and then there's the excitement and determination of accomplishment that I'm going to chase what it is that I want to chase. So there's like the two aspects of motivation here that play into one another to drive me to work harder. But that still doesn't detract from the fact that work in itself is not sexy. Like, work is still just work, and it's something that I must do consistently over time, slowly. And things and outcomes don't immediately come all of a sudden. It's very much delayed. So that has been 4 of the most meaningful sections to me in this first chapter of Ego is the Enemy. It's talk, talk, talk. Don't be passionate. Get out of your own head and work, work, work. And that's it. It'll be interesting to see how these lessons from the books get rewired into my thinking process, because admittedly, I find it hard to apply the concepts I've read from books. It's kind of embarrassing. I read so many like self-help books, but I feel like nothing like really sunk in. So in the sense of doing this episode, I really want this book, Ego is Enemy, to really sink into my thought process, because I think there's so many good lessons in it that I at least have the impression of in my first read around. And the second read around is very much ingraining those lessons into my psyche. And I can only do that by consistently repeat, consistently think, and reframe over and over and over again, such that I hardwire my thoughts to think in this way, which I think is going to pay me dividends long term. But yeah, that's it. That's a review of the first chapter and its relation to my life and me talking to my future self. I'll cover the next two sections, maybe next week or the weeks following that, but do expect that in the next couple episodes. With that said, I'll see you next week.